Afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon from London, UK. Good morning to those in US and Canada, and good evening for anyone in the Middle and Far East. This webinar is being recorded. Do use the chat. We'll take questions at the end. If we can't answer all the questions in the time we've got, we will deal with them on the recording. It's best if you mute your mics while speakers are taking place, and the videos off probably during that time. So this webinar is organised by the CIBS Intelligent Buildings Group in conjunction with the CIB. And for those of you not so familiar with CIB, it's the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction. It's been going since 1953. It has at least 40 commissions on various aspects of design, production, and research in many, many areas. Overall, we're concerned with sustainability, integrating processes involved in what we do, and resilience of urbanization. There is a World Building Conference in June 2022, which is being run at the RMIT University in Melbourne. And if you Google the CIB, you'll see something about that. I would also like to greet members from the Continental Automated Buildings Association, which is in North America. I think it's started in Canada originally. And we're very welcome to, if anyone's on the line from there, then it's very nice you're with us. This afternoon, we've got three speakers, Neil Pennell from Landsec, we've got Phil Obeda from SOM, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Konkana Khaund from Frost & Sulloven in Toronto to open with her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. Can you hear me? Phil, if you could, Derek, Phil, one of you, if you could just confirm.
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present here, and welcome everyone to our version of this presentation. So, excuse me. So I'll just quickly give you a brief background of who we are at Frost & Sulloven. We are a growth consulting company, but at the same time, we're a global research and consulting organization that has been in this practice for over 50 years now. I'm based here out of Toronto. I work as part of our consulting group, and my responsibilities include supporting our industry clients in consulting activities, but also promoting some of the thought leadership activities that we participate in a collaborative basis with industry organizations just like yourself. And of course, the Continental Automated Buildings Association here in North America. At Frost & Sulloven, of course, we've been in the forefront of all of these activities that have unfolded with the unprecedented events around COVID-19, particularly those that relate very closely to the energy industry, the environmental industry, and the buildings industry. This is my area of focus. I've been with Frost for over 14 years, and this has been my area of interest and focus through all of these years at Frost & Sulloven. We have worked with a number of organizations supporting a lot of the reset rebound activities, particularly at the enterprise side, but also we've worked with a lot of the regulatory organizations, supporting them with the data, the facts, to create those guidelines and reset measures. And we are actually very closely involved with a number of organizations within the building technologies industry. We did, of course, look at the economic impact. I mean, this is obviously bread and butter for our industry, but also many industries that are, horribly affected by this global pandemic. Based on our forecast, of course, we are projecting a turnaround for most of the industry segments, the product segments, particularly those that relate closely to the building technology industry, to be in the revival mode, kicking in towards the third quarter of 2021. Globally, this is, of course, the worst case scenario that we have looked at. We have looked at previous pandemics, done a comparison, and we feel that the impact that we are experiencing today from COVID-19, particularly with the fact that, today as we speak, this is practically escalated to the global emergency limits. And overall, the turnaround that is expected for the economies, as well as, global GDP revival for many countries that are affected, and more particularly the industry segments that impact the building environment is going to be extremely slow, and the revival is only projected towards the end of 2021. And by and large, of course, as I said, many industries are going through extreme negative impact of COVID-19. However, there are some positives, and quite frankly, the building services industry is one of them, where we certainly see significant amount of opportunities that could emerge in terms of creating resiliency within the built environment, being able to cater to the new requirements of the workforce, as well as the technology challenges that are going to be front and center of this industry going forward in terms of creating those and future-proofing our buildings, really. So we look at a variety of industries, particularly those that have a very close impact to the built environment. And because of my focus within the energy and environment space, of course, we look at the crossover impact that comes from all of these different interrelated segments and sectors that impact the built environment, and how do they sort of collaboratively impact the functions, the responsibilities, the roles and responsibilities that the cities have to deliver in an urban environment. Obviously, within the built environment itself, alternate workspace pretty much became an overnight reality, as we saw with what happened to the lockdowns and the requirements around the lockdown that kicked in globally back in February and March. Overall, of course, this required tremendous amount of recalibration of hard technologies within the built space, creating alternate workspaces, allowing for some of the physical technologies within the building to synchronize more and more with environmental quality conditions and safety, etc. Overall, I think this is something that is going to continue for a very long time. It's only starting now, and there are safe start strategies that are being put in place by various organizations around the world. On the energy supply and demand side, also we are seeing tremendous amount of new changes. There is, of course, very stringent scrutiny around supply chain innovation, for instance, which is also going to have a critical impact on how our buildings function going forward. And overall, what we are seeing is that for every single industry, there is a tremendous amount of requirement for building in those innate, self-sufficiency measures, self-corrective measures, and collective healing is really one of the ways forward for any single industry, and particularly so for the built environment. Within the intelligent building space, there are very specific areas that we, obviously look at as our industries deal with this imminent slowdown and the fundamental shifts that COVID-19 has brought about. There are obviously distinct challenges which the built environment is facing today, and the ecosystem of solution partners that cater to this space. And clearly, the emerging future scenario could magnify this well beyond what we have imagined today. When we talk of dealing with COVID-19 challenges, mitigation measures for our buildings, there are three main areas to address. So these measures have to be capable of handling the airborne viral load, the surface-borne viral load, and the behavioral viral load that impacts this space. And that encompasses a variety of things. So firstly, we have to look at repurposing the buildings themselves, reversing the open office concept that we propagated in the last decade. So this presents tremendous redesign challenges, refurbishing requirements to be undertaken for owners and occupants. And then added to that is the recalibration of systems and controls to fit the new occupancy patterns, for instance, in our buildings. And that is something that a lot of this, is currently being addressed by different organizations and associations, like, for instance, in North America, ASHRAE has laid down certain guidelines. The American Industrial Hygiene Society have laid down certain safe start strategies for facility managers to follow. So these are going to be very critical going forward, and these are only the baseline requirements that we're seeing today. This could tremendously change, and new requirements could very well find their way into these guidelines going forward. The critical measures, of course, concerning cleaning, sanitation, addressing indoor air quality, environmental quality challenges, trying to go touch-free, contact-free when it comes to vertical transportation systems, for instance, or access control into buildings. The most immediate areas that are being looked at are obviously all of these. Now, from here, we will see more integration of biosensors, for instance, for pathogen detection, integration of such technology into our mobile devices, mandatory antimicrobial interior finishes for buildings, for instance. So these are also going to be critical requirements going forward. However, all of this comes with tremendous amount of hindrances in terms of shortages of working capitals, wage liabilities, for instance. FM companies are trying very hard to respond, to become response ready, and whether or not the limited budgets would allow for such technology changes that our buildings will warrant for dealing with COVID-19 is really a very huge question that is looming large for our industry today. So if we go to the next slide, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I wanted to discuss here a little bit is in terms of the key predictions that we are starting to address right now. So I think one of the concerns, just as we emphasized a lot on health and air quality, etc., for our buildings soon as the lockdown procedures kicked in, I think one of the concerns that has been pretty important for us to look at is, will energy efficiency take a backseat in all of this? Because now we are suddenly emphasizing so much more on health and critical welfare issues for our buildings. Well, we think that building managers will look for energy management solutions that go beyond occupant comfort and sustainability. It has to at some point synchronize with emergency response support, for instance. So the ability to recalibrate environmental quality is critical from the EMS to support pandemic-ready needs. We are also going to witness connected security and safety preparedness plug into the EMS, for instance. So exploring some of the pandemic-ready use cases will become mandatory for real estate developments, because we now have to be ready with for instance, pop-up infrastructure to support pandemic-related requirements. So either as a dedicated wing or a standalone unit in a campus, complete with environmental calibration, will be necessary to maintain even accreditations for these buildings. So all the rating solutions, the rating systems that we have here, whether it's a reset standard or a well building standard or a LEED standard, for instance, will eventually be looking at some of these requirements for accreditation of these buildings as well. However, I think the digital empowerment of the ecosystem is also very, very important here, and the ability to deliver these solutions in real time via digital transformation of both internal businesses of people within the ecosystem of the built environment and the client-ready solutions that will hold the key for success for solution partners and the industry solution providers. But along with that, I think one of the critical changes that we are going to see is the big change that it has brought about to the workforce and the workplace. So an interesting outcome of all of this is how the workplace will cater to the workforce. As we saw, work from home became the overnight reality for all companies. So not only workplace requirements will change, but the workforce itself will undergo transformations, and new employment models will emerge to cater to these changes. What I'm sharing here is from a very recent in-depth research that we undertook to look at the future of the workforce and the workplace post-COVID. Connectivity will continue to drive both workplace changes as well as emerging employment models. Now, some of these models have already been successfully implemented. So they have taken off, for instance, freelance brokering, for instance, or even an uncollared model. So Uber probably is one of the best examples for this. However, going forward, I think it will be models like microtasking, dispersed networks, that will unlock the maximum potential for corporations. And our buildings and technologies that go into them will need to revamp to address these changing requirements of the workplace and the workforce. So what we have traditionally seen, the headquarter, the satellite offices around it, the project office or the co-working workspace, all of that is now immediately transforming into a network of, project offices, virtual offices, satellite offices, tremendous amount of interlinkages. So there is a requirement to cater to these from a technology standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. And in addition to that, of course, when you talk about the new guidelines that has to kick in to cater to the built environment, obviously looking at it from the perspective of environmental quality, catering to all of these from the standpoint of environmental quality is also going to be very, very critical. So in North America, of course, and I'm pretty sure that this is true for any part of the world today, where some of the industry associations, the organizations that support various ecosystem players and partners have already started to work around workplace strategies. For instance, companies have come together to create voluntarily some of the strategies that they want to propagate in order to help building owners, occupiers sort of open up their buildings under the current circumstances. So in North America, ASHRAE has, of course, come forward to put together the MEP Safe Start strategies, essentially looking at some of the critical components of the building. So whether it's a thermal environment, humidity and moisture, for instance, pathogen detection qualities, air filtration, which is very, very critical, of course. Traditionally, we have had standards that support the need for minimum more 13 type of filters, but now the requirement is really to try and go to more 15 and 16 and so on. Along with that, of course, the surface-borne viral load, which is, of course, ultimately one of the critical aspects to control, which also, ties in very closely with the behavioral viral load. I think looking at all of these strategies is really very critical from the standpoint of creating resiliency within these built environments going forward. And this is, of course, one of the things that has been followed very closely by majority of the building owners, occupiers, and particularly the facility management companies, concentrating on all of these MEP Safe Start strategies to really help open up these buildings in a safe manner for occupants. And in addition to that, of course, there are critical areas that we are seeing building owners, occupiers, and facility managers really focus on here. I mean, there are guidelines that are unfolding at a state level, federal level, local government level, for instance, but then these are still very, very work in progress type of guidelines, because, we don't know what the future really holds and how much of these guidelines in reality at the ground level can be implemented without any roadblocks and barriers. Because, controlling the built environment where there is a dynamic, event at any given time to concentrate on with occupants being there is really not very easy to really follow through some of these guidelines that are put forward. So what we are seeing is that at the ground level, there are some critical challenges that are emerging in terms of really following through these guidelines. So there could be potential changes in these going forward. What we are seeing is that the standalone equipment, so whether it's your building automation or your HVAC or the air treatment control systems in the buildings, obviously these are being looked at very stringently. There are ways of eking out more efficiency out of these systems. So these are things that we are seeing a lot of facility managers and building operators really concentrate on right now. Also really optimizing what you have in the building. Before you wait for new technology to emerge and hit this place, it's really looking at what you already have in the building in terms of your sensor network. How do you optimize that sensor network to really feed in the information that you need to for crowd analytics, for instance, for control measures in buildings, to really detect safety hazards in the building. So these are things that already are being concentrated on right now. In terms of course, the tremendous amount of pressure that this puts on the facility management service companies, that's of course something that is going to continue. What we are seeing amongst facility management companies is that they are also trying to see if they can create some guidelines themselves, some certification tools and processes themselves in place to certify their workforce better in terms of being prepared to handle some of these requirements of healthy and safe buildings going forward. There's not a whole lot of examples, particularly coming out of North America at this time, to talk about in terms of what new changes will be implemented to create what we would call a resilient smart building or a resilient intelligent building that is also COVID-19 compliant. But what we did see with this particular case, this is Chicago's Fulton Market District, Fulton East building, which is a 90,000 square feet facility, mixed-use facility with a composition of commercial and retail. In this building, what we did see is that they have actually implemented a lot of the technologies that already exist today to allow the building to be as close compliant to COVID-19 requirements as possible. So this includes everything from air purification systems that they went in for, the touch-free thermal scanning technologies that they implemented, elevator systems, for instance, very nascent company called Mad Elevators that actually came in to provide the door-to-go elevator system that is already in place and something that can be leveraged. So a lot of the existing technologies that are in place can actually quickly be leveraged to create these kind of resilient infrastructure. In addition to that, of course, there is a lot of touch-free technology and antimicrobial finishes that they have used. So these are some of the things that, obviously building owners, technology vendors will be looking forward to try and incorporate more from what we have in the existing arsenal to really fortify these infrastructure premises going forward. But in addition to that, of course, we are closely looking at the startup landscape to detect some of the new requirements that will be necessary to implement and which would be some of these new wave technologies that will hit the space to actually support some of these requirements in healthy buildings going forward. Overall, I'd like to leave the audience with a couple of takeaways from what we are seeing. So from an economic standpoint, of course, this is the worst hit from what we can assess, comparing it with past, downtrends. But this is entirely unprecedented, and as we can see, I mean, the overall revival is going to be extremely slow because of the uncertainty of the event going forward. And although we are predicting a sort of a incline in the growth curves for various industries from post-quarter 3 of 2021, this is still going to be an extremely slow process. But what is critical is really the reliance of digital technologies. We are seeing the incorporation of AI-driven technologies to actually support some of the new normal requirements of buildings. And this is going to be one that will unfold the key for new opportunities, that will resonate better with the new requirements of buildings going forward. As I said, I mean, there's tremendous amount of changes that facility managers, facility management, asset management companies will have to deal with in this situation. So really looking at data to help them take and drive these decisions and to do things in a quick, resilient fashion is really going to hold the key. We are going to see a lot of reliance on standards like WELL and RESET. We are seeing a lot of vendors, technology vendors actually promoting their products and technologies as compliant with WELL requirements or RESET requirements. This is definitely going to be a trend, because it is going to allow for that level of assurance for occupants, for tenants to feel safe within these buildings. So as if the technologies or the products and solutions are compliant with well requirements or reset requirements, this level of accreditation is going to be really, really important and critical going forward. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation and hand it over to Derek to continue with the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konkana, for that. That gives us a lot of interesting things to think about there. But we'll take questions at the end. So let's move on now to Phil Abeda from SOM. Over to you, Phil.
Great. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with the group here. I think it's a great subject. It's a great time to be speaking about intelligence and resiliency. And I'm going to share with you some of the thoughts we have here at SOM. If you bear with me one moment. So just a quick introduction. For those who don't know, SOM is a long 80+ year design practice of architects, engineers, urban planners. We've taken a very particular look at what the post-pandemic world is going to shape to be, how we as designers can respond, how we can set out a vision and roadmap, and clearly how climate change plays a role in this is shaping up the way that we set our approach to buildings and the built environment. So I'm Phil Abeda. I'm one of the architects here at the London office within the technical design group, and really across the firm, this is a subject that is very close to our hearts. So with that, I wanted to introduce what my take on the subject would be, and that's coming from the principle of where resilience lies in the future, how reliant we're going to become on intelligence as a way to address those needs, and really now what the role of buildings going forward can be in resiliency. What we understand, or what we like to understand, is that resilience comes from an equitable relationship between communities and their built environments, and it's something that we understand. It's something that works well in harmony. We take a look at what the pandemic has done, how it's reshaped our dynamics of how we relate with our community, how we relate with our buildings, and it's really reset a lot of our principles. So what have we learned in this process? We can certainly take a look at the impact that lifestyle choices have had to make over the course of this year, and we can see that the changes to travel, the changes to commuting, and to the major disruption and impact we've had to accommodate, that has had an impact on greenhouse and global gas emissions. But when we take a look at how far we have to go to get to our 1.5 degree targets from the Paris Accord, we're going to have to sustain these kinds of changes year upon year. So whilst this has been quite an impact to accommodate, we're going to have to brace ourselves for year upon year of lifestyle impact, and how ready are we to accommodate that? The dichotomy between the health of being outdoors and the health of being indoors has never been brought into sharper focus. We certainly understand the benefits of outdoor, the quality of air, and how much we depend on that outdoor experience. And yet we take a look and see just how disproportionate the amount of time we spend indoors and outdoors really are. And it questions, how much more now do we depend on the quality of our indoor environments for a healthier well-being. We also take a look at what the impacts of digitization has had in the last few months. The adoption acceleration in some places has been 10 years, and somewhat irreversible. And yet again, that's been another form of disruption, form of adaptation that we've had to accommodate, and it's one that's going to certainly become a key part of our everyday life and our everyday living. But it begs the question, when we look at our built environment, why is it that it lacks resilience? Why is it that the purpose and function of our buildings were rendered obsolete in just a few weeks, in just a few months? What then is the role of buildings as we move forward? How is it that we can find new purpose? How can they how can they adapt, and how can they teach us to adapt along the way? We do believe buildings hold a place in the future. Whilst we've accepted and accommodated working and living in remote fashions, communities do engage around buildings. But how can we continue to engage with our buildings? How can they continue to find a path for us to find new relevance and new meaning in the built environment, and how can they also become a path towards resilience in the future? Perhaps then, as we take a look at that role and the relationship we have with buildings, perhaps the role for intelligence is something which can be key to unlocking that, and perhaps that plays a greater role than we had first anticipated. So I'd like to break down the idea of what intelligence means, particularly to a group who's probably as learned as this one. But if we look at intelligence as the act of learning, as the act of the application of knowledge, and think of this in its cyclical form, we can see this as another interpretation of adaptation, and our ability to adapt is going to be key to resilience. We think about buildings needing to adapt. We understand that we as a community need to learn how to adapt, and the role that intelligence can play in allowing both buildings and communities to adapt is going to be vital, but also just as vital, it's how buildings can be there to encourage us and enable us to adapt in the future. Probably one of the greatest adaptations we're going to have to accommodate is the Paris Accord target of addressing climate change. And looking across the three scopes that were set out in the Accord, the third one, that of adaptation of us as users of buildings, users of the built environment, is certainly going to be one of the key ones, one of the challenges, because our behavior and our behavioral choices are going to be ones that need the greatest influence to address those changes, and how are we ready to embrace those changes? What better place to start than perhaps a school? This is the Kathleen Grimm School for Leadership and Sustainable Design at Sandy Ground in New York. It's one of our projects that we're most proud of here at SOM. It's a benchmark for sustainable ambitions, but it's also a key one for the discussion of resilience and future. One of the interesting aspects of this is that it's a building that actively looks to engage the students, the staff, the visitors with the idea of how a building performs and how their actions can be better understood, and how that in turn can influence and promote a different behavioral choice. As you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, achieving net zero energy was heavily reliant on the idea of post-occupancy. And that engagement with building operators, with the staff, with the students, beyond the design and handover of the building, was a fundamental part of learning how to use a building, how to adapt to work with the performance of the building, and seek a means of achieving a goal of net zero. And it's been one that through monitoring, through careful, close relationship, we've been able to achieve that. But I think what's key is that it's a building and a school that acknowledge that perhaps it had to change some of its approaches to setting out its structure of the day and its curricula, and actually work in tune with the performance of the building, find ways to understand when the best times to teach, where the best places to teach could be. And that could vary across the day, could vary across the seasons, but looking to have greater synchronization between building and occupation and usage was going to be key to adapting the nature of how we learn and the nature of how the building can teach us to adapt. Engaging users with buildings can take many forms. This is an example of our 350 Mission Street lobby in San Francisco. It's one in which digital art takes center stage right there in the main space of the lobby. It's a place that is not just informative, it's also interactive. It's there to find ways of changing and adapting the space, the mood of the internal environment, engaging individuals with that space, with that artwork in a very dynamic way. But it's also one that tries to link users with the engagement of the artwork, find ways for information of the building's performance to be shared with the users, ways to feedback information to the building. So it's looking to create a relationship in a responsive, dynamic way between the building and its users. Perhaps one of the great ways to engage users with their building is to really bring to center stage some of the most inconspicuous elements of a building, such as air filtration. So this is an example from our Public Safety Answering Center in New York, which does just that. It's using one of our particularly prototyped systems called the AMP system. It's looking to integrate biophilia and plants into the center of our buildings, have it linked to our HVAC systems, and using the careful and integrated technology, looking to clean the air around 200 times more effective than what plants would have been able to clean alone. And being designers, this is something that we wanted to celebrate. We wanted to prototype. We wanted to bring to the forefront, to find users being able to engage with this element of the building, understand how buildings work, and bring these to a level of integration in a building that could perhaps suggest that there's greater ways to celebrate well-being and holistic health for users inside these built environments. But what if buildings could then influence more? What if buildings could influence our relationship between habitation and mobility? So this is an example of a project. It's called AMI, which is the acronym for Additive Manufacturing Integrated Energy. It was designed and developed in collaboration with the Department of Energy in the US and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The principle behind this was we had a habitated building envelope that was integrated with solar PV cells. They're linking to a remote vehicle, which again was a 3D printed vehicle, and using that synergy between the building and the vehicle, the idea was that this remote transmission would allow the vehicle to transport the building and hence create a direct relationship between the building and the vehicle. Needing this to be a seamlessly designed piece of design and engineering, it was key for us to look at this as something that we could approach in the same fashion as the automotive industry. Kits of parts manufactured to allow for scalability, and using at the time fairly state-of-the-art principles of 3D printing. Also looking to accommodate efficient design and minimizing waste along the process. And whilst this was simply looked at the scale of a small building and a vehicle, we're now looking to take this to the second stage of our iteration, looking to see how can we scale this up? How can we see more and more parts of the community having greater interrelated relationships between distinct elements, creating closed loops between our built environments, allowing individuals to adapt their behaviors, to understand how systems can work in correlation with one another, rather than seeing elements of our built environments as islands upon themselves or as isolated components within the built environments. So within SOM, we're also looking further afield. We're asking ourselves questions about the post-pandemic world, about about what the resilient future could look like within the built environment, and how is it that we can adapt the built environment to allow us to adapt and become more resilient in the future? How can we make better decisions? How can we understand the consequences of our choices? So looking at this across all scales, right now we understand cities to be very much discrete components of the built environment. But really, if we start to reimagine cities as cellular components, elements where 15 minutes was all you required to connect within your smaller hub of work and live and retail and lifestyle. And what if these hubs then became interconnected hubs such that individuals had less reliance on greater commuting, but greater integration with their own community? And what if these live work hubs were there to improve the quality of life, to create more sustainable, more dynamic, and ultimately more resilient neighborhoods that could withstand change over the course of time? And certainly we see that the models for where offices are moving, that these can replace the need for centralized business districts and remote residential districts. This closer integration is going to be perhaps a key model where places such as Paris and others are adopting similar principles of a 15-minute cities and 15-minute hubs. Then as we start to look closer into the elements that make up our typical built environment, thinking about how we enter buildings, how we enter commercial buildings in particular, understanding that that choice and flexibility needs to become a greater part of the design, a greater part of how we integrate spaces that can allow choice as we arrive in buildings. How can these become breathable? How can they become navigable? How can we still maintain safe, clear arrival and access into buildings where distancing is still needing to be maintained, but still create a user experience as we arrive at buildings. As we start to look at the offices, which again I think was alluded to earlier in the previous presentation, a move away from the current offer of either cellular or open plan offices is going to be dependent on how the workspace can survive. We think the elastic office is going to be far more prevalent, one where you can toggle between open and closed environments, one where the needs can be adaptable over future, far more demountable, far more responsive, and certainly playing a different role to the offices that we currently see today. Buildings will need to continue to be breathable. As I was mentioning earlier today, the need for a greater health and breathability in buildings is going to become fundamental. Having much more natural ventilation, having users perhaps far more attuned to working patterns aligning with the cyclical elements of the environment, understanding how biophilia can play a role in that, not just in air quality, but in all aspects of health and well-being. We see travel fundamentally changing. The current approach to very much a barrier-driven security for airports, we understand why that needs to take place today. But as technology can find its way into alleviating the barriers and creating something that's more attuned to a free passage, how can we have airports and other forms of terminals allowing for greater barrier-free experience? And how can this become the antithesis to how we perceive travel today? Education has also taken a fundamental rethink across the pandemic. The remote working may well have offered a solution in terms of technology, but we still believe that schools, whether it's for primary or for further education, those schools are a fundamental part of developing social, emotional, intellectual growth, and a hybrid approach to schools where technology can allow for customized education, but the environment can be there to cater for what we as individuals and as a community require. We do believe that a different type of school could well become one that emerges from the post-pandemic. And as we think of further education, higher education, certainly the need for campus, the need for communities where thoughts and creativity are given space to flourish, where the physical environment is there to cater for the health and well-being, but having spaces that are far more adaptable, far less reliant on confined approaches to education, and where technology can play a role in trying to create a more customized approach to learning. And then going back to the idea that I had at the beginning, that this equitable relationship between the community and their built environments, that's going to become even more fundamental when we look at residential and all aspects of living. The idea that the dichotomy between work and live is going to create an opportunity for the third space communities, where elements that can tie those two, that aren't required to be accommodated just within the home, those can start to become knitted into communities, and it can provide a support which can offer a higher quality of life for individuals, for communities as well. And these are some of our insights into how we think the resilient future is going to shape. We think that there is going to be a future for buildings. We do think that there is an opportunity to see how they can allow us to future, to allow us to thrive, to flourish, and we're looking forward to seeing where this opportunity can take us. And at that, I'll hand over back to Derek.
Thank you very much, Phil. Very interesting, and I like your term, the elastic office. That's really good. You can see in those first two presentations the importance of doing much more measurement in buildings, and also the great importance in the role that facilities managers play. Right, for our last presentation, I hand over to Neil Pennell from Landsec. Neil, over to you. Hello, Neil. Unmute. Right, okay. Okay.
Got it now?
Yeah, okay, fine. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Right, good afternoon, everyone.
Sure.
Sorry about the technical hitch at the beginning. My name's Neil Pennell, work for Landsec, Head of Design, Innovation and Property Solutions. Landsec, for those of you who are not familiar, we're one of the UK's leading real estate investment trusts, and we own a significant portfolio in the UK, including office spaces primarily in London, and retail and leisure spaces across the UK, and some residential. So that's Landsec and what we do. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the sort of challenge that COVID-19 has presented to us, some of the lessons that we've been learning as we've adapted the existing buildings that we have, where intelligent solutions could play a part, and what are the sort of opportunities and barriers around that. Trying to think forward about using data to help decision making and making sure that the information is available to the users that need it. I think we're aware of the pandemic cycle now, and we're sort of somewhere between the end of the first wave and perhaps the beginning of the second wave. We're in a sort of interim transition phase, and I think once we've got over this particular pandemic, I think probably the lesson learned is that we have to be prepared for future ones. I don't think this challenge is the only one that's going to come along. It's probably, everybody I think understands the transmission paths. There's still research to do to see which of these paths is the primary cause of infection, but it's definitely going to be the touch and airborne processes that take that virus from person to person. And understanding those is also key to understanding where interventions can be made. I think perhaps one of the unexpected set of consequences we've seen on the environment is that even with all the shutdown across the world, I think on April the 7th, global emissions reduced by about 17%, which is great, but it does show how far we have to go to get down to a zero carbon world. And in the meantime, we've probably been creating a lot more waste with all the PPE and everything else that's come into play. There's been pressure on some wildlife habitat through lack of supervision of some of the key habitats that we have. And I suppose, interestingly, in terms of the world of intelligence and data and digital, obviously data center use has increased and will probably be a growth sector further into the future. I thought I'd sort of, before looking forward, look back a little bit. And I think that one of the major sort of functions of the built environment in the past has been to help to protect us from infection and disease. And I think maybe we've become a little bit lazy with that, with easy access to antibiotics over the last 50 plus years. We've sort of perhaps not taken the level of thought and precaution into our buildings that obviously we see now the benefit of, and the preparedness that's needed going forward. So I think we do need to look at how we do that, improving the health and well-being for people within the buildings. And not only within the buildings we have and the buildings that people use, we've also got to think about how we design buildings going forward and how we actually construct them. And an area that I've been focused on in recent times is design for manufacturing assembly. I think it was mentioned earlier, the sort of kit of parts approach to building. Again, if you can do much more pre-manufacture off-site, it means less people being needed on site, and with social distancing and maintaining the efficiency of construction, it seems that I think this will be given a further impetus as we go forward. I chair the British Council for Offices Technical Affairs Committee, and we produced a couple of papers in response to some of the challenges that we saw coming through from COVID and the adaptations that were needed. And obviously amongst them, it's about understanding the sort of measures that you could do to adapt spaces. But we also, I think, try to highlight that we need to think ahead as to, with the buildings that we're developing now and those that are yet to go on the drawing board, we need to start thinking about what are the things that we could do differently that would make those buildings more resilient, more easy to adapt, and more flexible to be able to respond to the challenges that we see. And part of that was an element of smart solutions. But I think that it's one part of the tools in the bag, if you like. Design and thinking about how we use buildings are just as important. So, you know, we've obviously seen a challenge from our perspective as a property owner. Obviously, we provide office spaces for people. We think we provide good spaces, but obviously we're now competing with people working from home, and the sort of big challenge in between moving from home into the office often is a public transportation system that puts you in close contact with people and makes social distancing difficult. So until we have some answers to the virus, that's going to be an enduring challenge. But the workplaces themselves, I think a lot of work's been done. And as we were going through the transitional phase and getting people back into the offices, those things are working well in terms of space planning the buildings, putting in place enhanced hygiene, big question marks about vertical transportation in buildings and high-rise buildings, but finding workarounds for that as people adapted their work style, varied the place of work between home and with the office as we started to move back until, as you probably know, as from tomorrow, we're back into a second lockdown in the UK. So it's sort of 3 steps forward and 2 back again. So as I say, one key area that people focused on has been challenging within buildings, particularly high-rise buildings, was the use of lifts. So we did produce a paper on that, looking at some of the steps you can take to minimise the risk in the use of vertical transportation systems, and again looking at some of the technology interventions that could perhaps help to provide that extra level of reassurance. And this is an example from Otis, but most of the major manufacturers are already putting these types of solutions forward, putting on UV lamps onto handrails on escalators, and trying to find ways of finding touch-free operation for people to use lifts. Even some promoting the use of air purification within the lift cars. I think a lot of the things that have been done up to now have been relatively low-cost interventions, but you know, this sort of screens that we've seen, antimicrobial surfaces, and increased hygiene, lots of management initiatives in terms of managing the peaks of people arriving to buildings and what the maximum utilisation of space can be whilst taking into account social distancing. But quoting Derek here, I thought would be good, and with the focus of this group being primarily on intelligent buildings and certainly the digital aspects associated with that, I think that buildings have been labelled as intelligence in the past, but the application of intelligence has yet to deliver its true potential, in the words of Derek. I think that this pandemic will be a great stimulus to people to take forward that thinking. It's about really looking at what is an intelligent building, and an intelligent building focuses not just on the building itself, but its interaction with the people that use it and the systems that provides a safe and productive workplace, or a safe and productive place to enjoy your leisure time or work or live or play, if you like, in using the built environment. Defining intelligent buildings, I think probably we all find struggling, because there are so many different aspects to a building. It can affect all aspects of the building, including the building's design and assembly, as I talked about previously. And obviously technology can impact on all aspects of buildings and how they're used. So very difficult to come up with a single definition, but maybe it's about more informed decision process sharing between the systems, making buildings more sensate, more able to respond. There's got to be a big focus on making sure that the space is safe and people can occupy it and enjoy this experience. Technology will be part of making that happen. and the use of internet-connected technologies will actually help us to be more adaptive and responsive, improving performance. I was asked to look at the barriers. I think adopting smart building technology into what we do, you always get within the world of certainly design and construction, there's reluctance to change. For building owners like ourselves, sometimes new ideas and new technologies are easier to introduce into new developments. To try and retrofit into existing buildings is expensive, and there's always a challenge around getting that return on the investment. There's lack of knowledge. The technology itself moves on quickly, so you invest in it and it rapidly becomes obsolete. Maybe cloud solutions in the future will provide a way that can be overcome to some degree. There's lack of appetite, people to take it on. There's difficulties integrating the different building automation systems together. I think, you see the example of, say, the mobile phone industry. If each of the different mobile phone providers had their own individual protocols, then the phones wouldn't speak to each other. But we have that in buildings with the systems. Everything's got different protocols, and as hard as we try and push the case to get open protocols and interconnections, we're always having to overcome it with intermediary solutions. I think the way that we construct buildings and refurbish them and extend them falls within existing contract models, which are difficult to actually take on board the intelligent building solutions that you really want to integrate into buildings. So I think we'll have to review how we actually procure buildings, whether it's a refurbishment or new build, to be able to add in more smart building technology. There is obviously challenges around cybersecurity. The more we rely on integrated and interconnected technology, the potential risk for people that want to do bad things to us, if you like. And obviously, in terms of some of the things that technology can do to help us to combat COVID-19, sometimes sort of crosses the line between personal data and anonymized data, and that can bring issues around the GDPR regulations. So there are barriers to taking those things on, but I think we can start to overcome those barriers. We need to create strong business cases on investing in the digital tools and the smart building solutions. If we start looking at a building's life cycle cost rather than just its first cost, we need to be able to analyze the data to really get an understanding of what can be done and set some smart targets that we can achieve by the introduction of new systems, new solutions. I think customer and market expectations are going to be high in this area now. People have become sensitized to the level of hygiene, to the ventilation of spaces, to making sure that they're healthy spaces to be in. We can always change contracting models. That just needs work to make that happen. And as we do this and people see the benefits coming through, then I'm sure that it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of people wanting to invest more and make their buildings more COVID secure and for future pandemics. But in any case, if you create a more healthy and building, then it's going to be healthy not just for this particular illness, but other illnesses that we already have to deal with will be reduced. So what are the opportunities? I think informing people so people can make good choices about what they want to do and how they want to use places. The touch-free experience, I mean, it's been talked about a lot because of one of the methods of contracting this virus and other infections is through touching contaminated surfaces. Trying to understand how we manage people flow and how they use buildings and spaces. And obviously being very clear that we can understand that cleaning's been done to a proper level and a proper cycle. All of those are really out there to get that operational effectiveness of the building as good as it can be. I think there are opportunities in retail. So people are aware of the requirements of hygiene. We've all started to change our behaviours. We're wearing masks. We queue up to go into spaces. There is still, though, I think, there's a challenge from the world of digital retail. But I think people still like to go into a retail world. They still like to interact with real things. So the challenge, I think, for the retail industry will be able to how they react to that and create their spaces such that people feel confident and secure in going into them and they can provide the experience that they're looking for. we've certainly, as we reopened our retail centres, we've seen a return to the shops and also our designer outlet centres. We've actually seen good conversion rates in people coming in and buying things. So from a retail perspective, there's been good success once we've reopened that retail world that we're now in the process of closing down for another 4 weeks. But it's a process that I think was said earlier. You need to be able to adapt and switch things in and out quickly to suit a particular point in a pandemic cycle. We've also seen obviously a great increase in touchless type technology. The smartphone will be, I think, a key part of going into the retail environment. Already we can pay touchlessly. Some people want to go to touch and feel things, but others may not want to come into physical contact, and therefore retailers will need to provide solutions to help them get the type of experience they're comfortable with in their stores. So what about the workplace? What about the office? Is it the end of the office or a new beginning? I think the latter. I think the way that we use the space will change. I think there will be a much more flexible level between how people work and use the facilities that the office space provides. And these are some of the benefits that you get from being in a workspace and the creative energy that comes from bringing people together. I think it's particularly important for people that are sort of new to the workplace, new to their organizations, and want to learn and understand from others, you know, how they best fit into that organization, how they provide their input, if you like, into the productivity of the business, but also are able to develop their careers and understanding and knowledge. You can do a lot through a screen, but there are some things that are just not the same. So will that be a result in more space being required, less space, or no change? I think the question's still out there. I think that there's been a progression to intensify the occupancy levels in offices over the last few years, which may reverse to some degree. I think a bit more personalised space, particularly during periods where you have community transmission of a pandemic disease, as we have now. There will be much more flexibility, I think, from employers for people to work from home and to work from the office. So I think the way we use our built workspace will change, but I don't think it will disappear as a need. I think it plays too much of an important role. So in terms of that new thinking, you know, I just put a load of quotes together. It was actually for another presentation, but I looked at this again and just went through and highlighted the sort of references within these various statements that sort of pointed towards a new set of intelligent buildings using technologies to help people to cope with the challenges that we face from living in a world with COVID. And I think, as already been mentioned, the office building in Chicago has been actively marketed as a building that's taken into account steps to make it a more resilient and attractive environment for people to go to. And I think if developers and owners see that these things create demand for their product, then that's what the investment will go into. Then obviously there's the other sort of view that the one-off pandemic has no impact at all. It has to keep coming back for us to take any notice. Well, I would say if you cast your mind back to those lessons from the past, you know, the reason why the built environment changed in those days was because problems kept coming back. You know, we had TB, we had other infectious diseases, so great amounts of light, good fresh air levels, buildings that were designed to reduce contact with the surfaces that can become contaminated, the choice of materials. You know, we used to have brass doors and copper surfaces, and that, you know, these things were put in place in buildings because they actually made a difference. But we, as I say, we've forgotten some of that. I think if we're going to invest more in technology than we already do, then we have to build the use cases, and there's lots and lots of ideas out there of things that you can do. One thing that frustrates me to some degree is that we already have lots of sensors and controls in most buildings these days. And I think we just need to work harder to get more from that before trying to reapply additional IoT solutions that are just another layer over the top of that doing the same thing. I think the IoT solution should be focused where we have gaps, and we should really look at trying to capture the information from all the sources that we've already invested in. Some opportunities for smart building technology. Obviously, we can look at capturing temperatures from people, but that comes with its GDPR challenges and a lot of issues around false positives. Smart cleaning, I talked about before, and that capacity and people flow management. I think somebody mentioned earlier about, you know, crowd monitoring and highlighting areas for people that need to perhaps avoid a certain area for a certain period of time. You know, if people want to go to the washroom, you know, you're trying to control the flow of people in there. You don't want loads of people standing around in a small space. So again, providing people with information so that people can judge the time when they want to use facilities within a building. From a building management perspective, having sort of real-time or close to real-time data dashboards that tells you what's going on in your portfolio buildings will enable you to act remotely. When we had to sort of reduce the operational levels in our office buildings, it was necessary for people to go to the buildings to carry out changes to control regimes and the like. Actually, it would be much better if a lot of that could be done remotely. We already have some capability of doing that, but I think it's an opportunity now to sort of think again, if you have a portfolio of buildings, as to how you can make that a bit more seamless. As I said, the point, the IoT sensors and devices, a lot of people putting those things forward. I would see them as something that should be focused on the things that we don't already know, and we should get the information for the things that we do know in a presentable form where it can be used. Indoor air quality is obviously critical. We've all seen that great ventilation in a space is one of the major aspects of providing you with the first level of defense, if you like, in terms of catching any virus, but particularly COVID-19. So monitoring that, and I think I've seen recent papers put forward that, you know, a good proxy for the ventilation efficiency in a space is to measure the CO2 level. And I think, again, we can gain understandings where we have good spaces, not so good spaces, how spaces are being used. And because resilience is important, we need to get ahead of the game, use the information we have to do predictive maintenance so that we can keep really core key systems working and working effectively. So if we're looking at intelligent building strategy at this point in time, I think we've got to look in 3 areas. There's probably the largest challenge is the buildings that we already have, and what do we do with those? How do we adapt them? What do we retrofit? Current projects that are sort of already progressing through and maybe are moving on site or going through the later stages of design needs to be looked at urgently to see what steps can be taken to improve their resilience to these challenges going forward. And then for future development, start to reimagine how buildings can be, depending on, you know, what they're aimed at. I think we saw in the previous presentation some of the ideas about how schools and offices and other spaces can start to respond to these new challenges that we face, and also how we need to behave differently, if you like, in the way that we use buildings. I think data will be a really important part of that, and if we can use data to actually drive our decision making, then hopefully we'll make better decisions. This is just a little bit of a sort of perspective that Gartner put together a few years ago, trying to look at how you could use data to assist in the decision making process. You know, finding out what happened, why did it happen, what will happen, and then what should I do, and then ultimately enabling a system to take a decision where you feel it can act correctly and quickly to improve a situation. Just looking at an example here, we were looking at some intelligent processes, and we thought we'd sort of try and look at how would we improve the way that we just get data from energy together. You know, if we do this properly, we can actually get reactive maintenance, we can look at proper life cycles, we can start to diagnose from the data what we need to do. That can give us predictions that enables us to actually put that together with the physical space within a building and models that we have, and which is a building information model now, but might become a digital twin in the future. We're going to be able to start using machine learning and analysis to take decisions for us. And these same thought processes can be applied to any control process, and the ones that are dealing in actually trying to maintain the quality of the space, the indoor air quality, the health and well-being of the occupants in the building are going to come right to the top of the priority list. So it's all about making interactions as frictionless as possible. and it's good to talk. At the end of the day, if we're able to gather all this data, if we're able to use the systems we have and try to plug the data together to make more informed decisions, then we have to make that information visible to all the people at the right time when they need to use it. And I guess that's also a challenge, but we have the tools to overcome that. I think we already have many of these things in place, and I think these are all going to become part of the answer to us being able to use buildings much more intelligently, as well as the buildings themselves being more intelligent. So as we look forward, are we going to go back to normal, or will it be a new normal? Well, to some degree, how much we do go back to the old normal might depend on what we can do in terms of mitigations for the virus, and particular the success or otherwise of an immunization program with vaccine. But in the meantime, and maybe well into the future, technology is going to play its part to help us to deal with these situations. And that was all I had to say for now. It'd be interesting to see what your questions are. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for that very fascinating overview. Konkana has unfortunately had to leave us because she's got another meeting, and I'm sorry we are running slightly late on the question time. Not a lot of questions in the chat column, but Lawrence Lisk does remind us that we've seen a lot of nice concepts and changing scenes in these presentations, which are a challenge. But it's also brought us down to earth a little bit that ventilation is very important, as you've all said. But there are practical things like in use buildings, when you're trying to update buildings, belt drives he brings up as a big factor that is common. And of course, if you have a breakdown with your air supply, this is rather important. I don't know whether Lawrence wants to come back to add anything more to that. If you do, if you signal by hand or in the chat column, I'll let you in. I was going to say something about certainly people perhaps don't realize their relationship with buildings and how important it is. And several of you mentioned this. And perhaps we're not very good at helping our customers to understand how to work with their building more effectively. So maybe there's a big area of concern there to look at. Now, I will go back to Lawrence, who's got his hand up. Lawrence, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Would you like to say something else?
Yeah, I just would like to try and raise this issue that I think there's a really good opportunity to retrofit. I've done thousands of surveys in the UK, and I'd say probably 75% of those buildings have got single belt drive fans, and if the belt goes, then they will lose, the ventilation until they can get someone in there. And I think retrofit's really important. Is only I think 5% of the building stock is renewed each year in the UK, and I just would like to try and raise the issue. I think it's also could create jobs as well. But the EC fans do provide feedback through Modbus or through BMS, and I just want to raise the issue.
Thank you, Lawrence. Neil, have you got anything to come back on that, or?
I think obviously people will probably look for resilience more in the ventilation systems they have done previously. I mean, a lot of extract systems, washrooms in particular, are obviously a confined space. You have all potential transmission paths present in that area. We have run standby fans usually on extract systems. I think there might be a bigger push to actually have proper supply air brought into those spaces rather than relying on air being transferred. So I think ventilation and the focus on it will grow. In terms of resilience in the central plant type location, you could put run and standby motors in it, and hopefully it could fit within the same fan section. You could take those sections out and replace them with fan decks with multiple small fans, probably of the nature that Lawrence is suggesting. So I think when people start to realise the importance of ventilation and that it needs to be a much more resilient system than is perhaps it's usually thought needed, I think that will start people investing in those things.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, Shamoon Karimji has asked a question. What elements of electrical building services do you think would need to be reviewed post-COVID? Anyone like to, either of you, take on that question, or anyone else for that matter?
I think the security system will be an important one because of its interface with access to and from a building. If you're going to try and make more seamless access into a building, then we're going to be relying on the use of contactless type approaches to get through into a building, automation of doors, and being able to call lifts without having necessarily touch buttons, etc. So I think that a lot of those things, being able to identify people and to give them the authority to pass through spaces in that more seamless way, will require those systems to be reviewed and better integrated. So I think that certainly the electronic control system elements of electrical services will come under renewed scrutiny. In terms of the base building electrical distribution, I mean, normally that's quite a resilient system in the way that buildings are heavily dependent on power to function for all sorts of reasons. But it may be in buildings that don't have that good a resilience, perhaps there would be some retrofit there on electrical infrastructure.
Right.
Yeah, I think taking that same idea forward, I think we're certainly seeing as more developers approach us on the topic of refurb, of adaptive reuse, the ground plane experience is fundamentally quite different to what we had, how we'd approached it back in the 80s and the 90s, and certainly in the 90s. And looking back on Canary Wharf and those areas, the idea of a far more secured front door is quite a different approach to the idea of barrier-free experiences and far more openness, but finding ways to keep security better integrated. And I agree. I think technology is going to allow that barrier-free experience of ground floor planes to exist. I think also as office spaces need to be adaptable, we'll have to again think about how electrical services get distributed within buildings such that they can facilitate a very different approach to plug and play expandable and elastic office spaces.
Thank you. Can I now invite Abdul Hadi Nawawi to comment? He's put here lovely excellent presentations. Can you comment critically the management's ability to embrace a whole host of newer measures and operating standards, not only for the safety of the employers, but also to maintain business continuity? And several you have in your presentations referred indirectly to some of these things and the barriers that Neil spoke about. One of our challenges is to cope with a new approach, a new way of thinking things which we've done for years in a particular way. And the pandemic is making us stop, rethink, hang on a minute, perhaps we need to think about this a bit more carefully, a bit more deeply, whatever it is. That certainly applies in case of ventilation. And also standards. I mean, the problem with standards is they take a long time to derive, and then they're kind of set for a long time. But the pandemic's showing us that things can move very quickly. And in addition, of course, technology is moving very quickly. So we've got to be quite light-footed with how we cope with dealing with standards. Anyway, over to either you, Neil or Phil. Would you like to make some comments on Abdul's question?
Do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, happy for you to.
Okay. I think that yes, people have got to think differently. I think there will be, that the whole of the world's population has been re-educated in the importance of taking care in terms of hygiene, understanding the virulence of these types of events and the dangers that they present. So I think people will have a growing expectation of what they expect from the spaces that they go into, whether that's the physical changes that are made to the building, whether it's the smart systems that are embedded within them to help them remain safe and secure in those buildings and to promote the health and well-being of the spaces that they're using. But there's going to be responsibilities on people who own, manage and operate those spaces to also ensure that they meet those expectations. So I think for those companies and organisations and public bodies that are able to respond to that, they will be the most successful going forward in terms of attracting and retaining customers, staff if it's a workplace, and obviously if you're building homes for people, the same. I think people will probably be looking for homes to change going forward with perhaps more generous spaces for people to work in if they need to work from home. So the whole process of how we think about our built environment, we do need to take into account the lessons that we're learning from this process. So I think that those that see that and act quickly will be those that are the most successful. And certainly, you always need to understand what your user base, what your customers want, and those that provide the right solutions are those that are sustainable into the future.
Bill, did you want to? Yep.
I was going to say, I mean, certainly we're learning lessons about the flexibility of where we work and how we work and when we work. And the confines that we previously understood, that each person has a dedicated desk and works between dedicated times, it's hard to see that becoming a normality again. We certainly think that when we look at the makeup of offices, the quantum of flexible workspaces compared to dedicated workspaces and the balance of meeting spaces, I mean, that's certainly going to shift. The idea of needing to accommodate far more flexibility is going to be key. The way that people book their spaces, again, technology can allow that to take place. So perhaps we don't need to have as many people within a building at any one given time. Perhaps offices can provide space far less in terms of square meterage to accommodate the same workforce, because they can manage with technology a different degree of occupation, and that in a sense can also start to alleviate the population within buildings with the density loads in the transport arriving into the building. So certainly I do see that there's going to be a shift in those peaks as people arrive sort of to and from their work.
Thank you. Now, Alex Smith has raised a question. He's talking about hospitality spaces like restaurants and cafes, which often lack mechanical ventilation, often have closed windows. I've certainly experienced that. Very, very uncomfortable, never mind all the infection as well that could take place. How can we intelligently retrofit these buildings to make them safe, especially if they become third spaces for home workers, so flexibility of home and office and other spaces? How can we educate owners and users of the importance of good ventilation? Now, this is very difficult because obviously thinking about restaurants and bars and cafes, they're all under enormous economic pressures at the moment, as we all realize. So they're probably not going to be welcoming spending more money on things. On the other hand, there does have to be a change of attitude that these things are more vital than we realize, good air, circulation and so on. How do you think we can overcome that in making the message of the importance of air flow and so on highly important, not just in big offices, obviously in schools, obviously in the home, but also in these other social, cultural centres?
Yeah, certainly the decarbonising of transport is going to be key to cleaning our air, and we mentioned briefly on commercial spaces, but we do think that a return to natural ventilation is going to be it's going to be fundamental and probably much more feasible in the near future as electrification is more prevalent. We certainly see the results for for education and what benefits natural ventilation brings. We're certainly pushing, even within retrofits, to see if we can have greater volume of air. Maybe up to 30% more fresh air coming into buildings than what we previously would have allowed for from mechanical systems. But natural ventilation is certainly key in new builds. I can understand the challenges with the with a refurb, but perhaps greater volume of air coming into those buildings is going to be a first step.
I think there's challenges to some degree with natural ventilation as well, because it can be intermediated by the way people use the buildings. It gets cold, so they shut the windows. So there's challenges as well as benefits from natural ventilation. I think buildings in the future should provide some easy access to good outside space where people can work as well as inside. I think that will be key. I mean, we generally in our buildings, and I've always been a keen advocate of lots of fresh air supply into the space. We put probably 50–60% more fresh air into our buildings typically than most of our competitors. And I think that's important because it provides that flexibility and resilience in the building, but it also speaks to creating a better indoor air quality, which is really important going forward. So I think it's going to be a mixture of all different aspects, where you can go outside and work in a semi-covered environment when the weather is good, and some place in the world it's good all the time. So, working inside and outside I think will be good. But ventilation of space, we need to look at it much more as a science and actually understand how airflows move around buildings, how we should design the systems to work. I think in the world of retail, though, as you pointed out, that finance is always a challenge. I suspect that it's going to take some degree of regulation properly to make any significant change in those sorts of spaces to happen over a period of time. I think some will use the opportunity where they have the freeboard to invest to improve their facilities and use that as a, if you like, part of the sales pitch to come to their particular restaurant or shop. But for many, it will be seen to be a burden, and we may have to drive that thinking through regulation.
Okay, Lawrence, you want to come back? No? No, he's got his hand up. No, he doesn't. Okay. Well, we are now coming to the end of our meeting. Just to mention, Shamoon has said, I can see more energy consumption post-COVID. Would you agree? Can you just give a brief answer to that?
To some degree, but I think it's all about what Phil was saying earlier. It's about the flexibility of response. We need to do certain things at certain times. The recommendation at the moment is that you run plant and equipment on for times outside of the normal occupancy period to keep purging the spaces and refreshing the air in the spaces. Obviously, in periods where you don't have mass transmission within the community, you don't need to carry on all of those things. So it's a matter of responding to the particular phase of the pandemic that you're dealing with, and using energy sensibly where it needs to be used. You use it, and as soon as you can go to a more efficient operational cycle, you do that. It's about control, it's about management, and about the systems that are designed and put in buildings in the first place being as efficient as they can be. So if they do have to be used more for whatever reason, then the impact on energy use is absolutely minimized.
Right.
I think if we keep using buildings the way we do today, then yes, it's easy to see how that can greater consumption can be the result. But changing our mindsets, thinking about spaces that have far greater diversity of uses across the day, such that we're getting a greater balance of how we use and consume energy in day and night conditions, making buildings far more active so that energy doesn't get wasted. See how we can try to transfer and share energy between functions within a building. I think there's strategies to conserve, and that's also going to come to changing our approach to how functions and spaces are segregated today, but how they can be better integrated in the future.
Right. I think we're now going to come to the end of our webinar. Not to leave on a negative note, but I was reading today in some medical journals, there are 7,000 plus more possible viruses that could come on the scene. So some of you have mentioned this isn't going to quickly go down. We have to live with infection risk as being an important part of the design and use process in buildings. And my particular area I was going to talk about later was ventilation, because it isn't just the quantity of air you put into the building. That's very important, of course. And natural ventilation can work in some circumstances extremely well. But we've got to pay more attention to what happens to the air in the building. You see, all the researchers that are looking at airborne transmission and surface deposition at MIT and Japan and so on, they're doing fantastic visualization studies of what's happening with the infection risk. We aren't doing anything much like that in ventilation at all. So we've got to balance that out to see how the air we put into the building, what it does inside the spaces to link up with those viruses patterns in the space. So that's an area where we have to perhaps do things in a lot more detail than we have before. We've mentioned antiviral surfaces. Neil referred to copper, and that's been used in the Crick building in London for handles and so on. And Konkana mentioned paint shield. I don't know if anyone knows about that, which is interesting. So there is going to be a lot of products coming out on the market claiming to do things. And I think that's another danger, is especially when we're talking about filtration, we're talking about UV radiation techniques for cleaning air and so on, talking about ionization possibilities. We've really got to make sure that we have the evidence if we're going to install these things in buildings and use them. So that's that. So on that, there's a lot more we could say. This will be put online, so you'll have some links. And I'd like to thank you all for attending. And I'd like to thank our presenters who've given 3 excellent papers, and those who also came in to request some questions and added some comments, which is very useful. So thank you all for coming. Our next seminar is going to be on November the 25th, and it's going to be on low carbon, organized by Mina Asman from SOM, as she is a member of the CIBSE Intelligent Buildings Group. So thank you all. Have a good evening and keep safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you again, Derek.